All right, in this chapter, we're going to cover the economic impact of unions. This piggybacks off of what we learned in chapter 10. First off, the union wage advantage. This is going to be the wage premium that union members get relative to non-union members in the same occupation. So let's say, for example, that steel workers that are unionized make $25 an hour and steel workers that are non-unionized make $20 an hour. Well, this is a $5 wage premium. There would never be a wage advantage if we had a perfectly competitive market. And the reason is because with perfect competition, you have a homogeneous product. That is, no matter who you buy the good from, it's the same product. So you would only buy the good from a business that can give you the lowest price. Price would determine who you buy from. But firms that were unionized would have to charge higher prices because their wages would be higher than non-union firms that would have lower wages. So the unionized firms could not survive in a competitive market. Technically, if unions were able to organize all firms in an industry, then they could avoid this problem. But that's very unlikely. So what unions tend to do is gravitate towards industries that are less competitive, so that they can get those higher wages, and the firms can then offset those higher wages by charging higher prices. The advantage that unions, or that we see for union versus non-union workers, may not be exclusively from union negotiations. There's what's called the measured wage advantage, which is the actual difference between union and non-union wages. But there's also the pure wage advantage, which is that portion of the measured wage advantage that results from union negotiations. So just because we see that union workers make $25 an hour in the steel industry and non-union workers in that industry make $20, doesn't mean that the unions in the steel industry negotiated a $5 premium. That's the measured wage advantage. But some of that difference could come from factors outside of union negotiations. We're going to talk more about that next. If we had a scenario where we could compare wage rates in a given labor market and all other conditions were held constant except for the presence of union, then the pure wage advantage, which is that's created by the union, would be the measured wage advantage. There'd be no difference. For example, let's say we have a demand curve for labor here, we have the supply curve here, and the non-union wage is WN. Q1 is the equilibrium employment. And let's just assume that's $20 an hour. Well, if the union wage were $25 and the only factor in this labor market was the presence of union, that is, the only thing that's different is the presence of unions, then we could say, well, that difference here, that $5 difference must be the pure wage advantage. We could calculate it as a percentage. Take the $25, the union wage, minus the $20 non-union wage. That gives you $5 in the numerator. Divide that by $20 as the non-union wage. You'd have a 25% union wage advantage, or pure wage advantage. The problem is that unions not only influence the wage rates of union workers, they also influence the wage rates of non-union workers. So it's possible that this difference that we see is not just a negotiated increase in wage for union workers. It could be that non-union workers' wages are being affected as well. They might go up because of the presence of unions. They might go down because of the presence of unions. Unions are affecting both union and non-union wages. To understand this better, let's take a look at the spillover effect. Spillover effect is the idea that as unions raise wages in the union sector employment will fall. And those workers that were previously in the union sector will spill over into the non-union sector, lowering wages, right? Displaced workers will flow into the non-union sector, driving wages down. Take a look at the graphs here. Let's say this is the union sector. We start out at W union, or actually start out at WN, non-union, and let's say this is the non-union sector, and we start out at WN. So if there's no union, then there'd be no difference in wages here. But let's now imagine that a union enters this sector here, right? And drives up the wage to, say, $25. And let's say the non-union wage is again 20. So the union has created a $5 increase. But you'll notice that there's a decrease in employment. The demand for union workers is going to go down as those unions drive up the wage from $20 to $25. So these workers are displaced. Well, where are they going to go? They're going to flow over to this market over here, the non-union sector. And they're going to drive the non-union wage down to WS, okay, which is the spillover effect, right? WS being the lower wage. So let's say that's 18. So what we would actually witness is a measured wage advantage of 25 for union workers versus 18 for non-union workers. But remember, the union actually only drove the wage from 20 to 25. The union only created a pure wage advantage of $5. But because of the spillover effect, it looks like the union created the entire measured wage advantage of $7, right? 18 versus 25. Now you can use the formulas here too and get percentages. So for example, if we put the measured wage advantage, if it's $25 for the union workers and $18 for the non-union workers, 21 or 25 minus 18, that is a $7 premium. Divide that by 18, and I get almost 39% measured wage advantage, the difference between the union wage and the non-union wage after the spillover effect. But the pure wage advantage would actually be the union wage, 25, minus the non-union wage, which was 20. Okay. So that's a $5 premium divided by 20 equals a 25% advantage. So the measured wage advantage shows up as much greater, 38%, than the pure wage advantage, which is 25%. In other words, the measured wage advantage overstates the pure wage advantage. It makes unions look better than they really are. What unions did is negotiate a higher wage, creating displaced workers that spilled over into the non-union sector, lowering non-union sector wages. All right, one of the mitigating factors here is going to be what's called wait unemployment. This is where an unemployed union worker may wait for a union job rather than taking a non-union job. If the wait unemployment effect is at work, then as these workers lose their jobs here, as these displaced workers from Q1 to Q2 lose their jobs, they don't spill over here, which means they don't drive down the non-union wages. So it has the effect of reducing the significance or magnitude of the spillover effect. Another effect is the threat effect. This is where non-union employers raise wages. Let's say we start here at 20 in the union sector and in the non-union sector, and then the unionization occurs. They get a contract that drives up the wage to 25. Yeah. What's going to happen though is these non-union firms, they're going to see this increase and they're not going to like it. The business owners are going to say, hey, this is concerning. If these firms over here unionize, it's only a matter of time before we end up unionizing. So they try to avoid that, right? And they avoid this threat of unionization by actually raising their wages voluntarily. So non-union firms are kind of forced to offer, via the threat effect, a higher wage than would otherwise be the case. Now let's take a look at the measured versus the pure wage advantage. Well, using our numbers from before, let's say the initial non-union wage is $20 and the union negotiates a $25 wage. Well, that increase would be the pure wage advantage, right? 25 minus 20 would be $5, divided by 20 would be a 25% pure wage advantage. The contract, in other words, would call for a 25% increase in pay. But because these non-union firms are going to respond to this, the non-union wage, let's say, was 20, but then goes up to 22 because these firms are afraid of the threat of union in their sector. So the measured wage advantage looks much smaller than the pure wage advantage. The measured wage advantage would be 25 for the union sector minus 22 for the non-union sector. That is, if we take the $3 difference there, right, 25 minus 22, and divide that by 22, we get a 13% or 13.6% measured wage advantage. So the measured wage advantage of 13% understates the pure wage advantage. The unions actually negotiated a 25% increase in the contract. But when you compare the union sector to the non-union sector, what you see is only a 13% measured wage advantage. So it actually makes unions look less effective than they really are. Next is the product market effect. This is about how unions raise wages and raise costs and ultimately prices for the products produced by union workers. This would cause consumers to move towards lower priced non-union products. If you think about it, customers are looking for the best deal. They may not even know if the company they're buying their products from is unionized or not. What they do know, prices are higher in one market than another, and they respond accordingly. So to understand the product market effect, let's again go back to our models. We've got unionized labor here and then non-unionized labor here. Starting at the non-union wage of, let's assume, $20, if the union is effective, they get the wage up to WU, $25, and we get that pure wage advantage of $5 or 25% from our calculations before. But because the union sector now has higher wages, they're going to have to charge higher prices. They're going to have higher costs and they're going to charge higher prices, which means customers are not going to be as apt to buy from the union sector. So now let's go over here to the non-union sector. How does this affect the labor market? Well, remember that demand for labor is derived demand, which means it moves directly with the demand for the product. So if non-union workers are seeing an increase in demand for their products because now their products are more price competitive, then they're going to see an increase in the demand for their labor, and the demand curve is going to shift up. That's going to show up as higher wages for the non-union workers. So let's say we go from $20 initially in the non-union sector to, let's do 22. Well, that's a $2 increase. Okay? But what's interesting here is that now the measured wage advantage is going to diverge from the pure wage advantage. You know, unions negotiated a pure wage advantage of $5, 25%. But when you compare the union wage of $25 to the non-union wage after the product market effect of $22, you're going to get 25 minus 22, which is 3 in our numerator, divided by 22, which gives us that 13% premium that we saw before, which means the measured wage advantage is 13%, understating the pure wage advantage. The unions negotiated an increase of 25% of $5 per worker. But it looks like the only difference between union workers and non-union workers is 13% or $3. So this is having a similar outcome to the threat effect, but a different rationale. With the threat effect, that non-union wage went up because the firms in the non-union sector were threatened by the potential of unionization and were averting that by offering higher pay themselves. This one is more indirect, where the customers are moving demand from union to non-union sectors and therefore driving the wages up for the non-union workers. Lastly, the superior worker effect is something to consider. This says that higher wages at union firms will attract more productive workers. If this is the case, then the measured wage advantage will overstate the pure wage advantage. Maybe unions negotiate the wage from $20 to $25. That's the pure wage advantage, a 25% premium. But because of the increased productivity of the workers they're attracting, you end up getting maybe a wage of 27 per worker. So if the union workers are making 27 and the non-union workers are making 20, that's a 35% measured wage advantage. overstating what the unions actually achieved. Okay, that's it for this one. I'll pick up in the next video. Thanks.